Nearly 50 years after its creation, Microsoft has finally become the most valuable company on the planet. It has a mind-boggling market cap of $3.19 trillion, overthrowing Apple, which stayed at the top for the last 13 years. Microsoft is a titan of the tech industry, and its influence on the world is undeniable. But what if I told you that a little over a decade ago, this tech behemoth nearly crumbled under the weight of its own ambition? There was a time when a single update, an operating system meant to revolutionize user experience, almost brought Microsoft to its knees. The culprit is the infamous Windows 8 operating system, which has gone down in history as one of the most hated operating systems of all time. It managed to shatter expectations, leaving everyone, including Microsoft, embarrassed. With all the hate and disappointment surrounding it, it's almost a miracle Microsoft was able to recover, let alone reach the current success. But before we delve into the catastrophe that was Windows 8 and its everlasting consequences, it's important to take a step back and explore the events that led up to its release. Before the abomination of Windows 8, Microsoft had a massive success with Windows 7, and when I say massive, I really mean it. This is going to make you feel old, but prior to its launch, Windows 7 surpassed Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows as the biggest grossing pre-order product of all time. Which is a crazy comparison because one's an operating system and one's a very famous book, as well as pre-ordering an operating system in the first place. But it just goes to show how successful it was. So in just 3 years, Microsoft had sold over 630 million copies of Windows 7, making it the fastest selling operating system in the company's history. There was even a time when 7 new copies of Windows 7 were being sold every second. And it's easy to see the reasons behind this explosive success. For starters, Windows 7 came right after Windows Vista, which, let's not forget, was another disaster almost on par with Windows 8. Vista was slow, clunky, and overall a nightmare to use. It also had extremely high system requirements at the time of its release, which made it unpopular even among enthusiasts.
Vista will and should continue to go down in history as the worst Windows launch ever.
The typical Windows Vista experience back then was to boot it up, look at it, realize it's a nightmare, and then downgrade to Windows XP within hours. It was actually so badly received that many people stayed on XP for a long time and almost refused to upgrade to Windows 7 just in case it was as bad as Vista. But after a long enough period of time with people saying, actually Windows 7's good, they did swap, and the reasons were pretty simple. It's what people wanted. It didn't have massive performance issues on pretty much all computers. It was also stable and rarely crashed during day-to-day uses. And one of the most important factors was that the UI was easy to understand and consistent throughout. Why was this important? Well, of course, a lot of computers are being used by businesses, and they don't want to spend more time training employees to use the new system. Because of this, Windows 7 found its way onto 50% of enterprise computers by July of 2012, which might not sound crazy considering Windows 7 came out in October of 2009. But most people will know if you work at a company, often the software that they use is years, even decades out of date, because they refuse to upgrade and learn new things and train people new things. The fact 7 took on 50% within 3 years was pretty damn impressive. And of course, while we can look at the raw data of sales, Windows 7 had another thing going for it. To give you an idea of just how beloved Windows 7 still is, in 2024, Windows 7 has more than 4 times the market share of Windows 8 and 8.1 combined. There's still people posting on social media like this. I still firmly believe that Windows 7 is the last good operating system from Microsoft. So to say the folks at Microsoft were confident in their software products after the success of Windows 7 would be an understatement. Sadly, their overconfidence led them to creating an operating system that, as one Redditor put it, solved a problem that did not exist. However, of course, things are complicated, and pinning all the mess of Windows 8 on Microsoft's arrogance would be unfair. Unfair just like facing the blue screen of death after enduring Windows 8's crappy UI. But jokes aside, we look outward, away from personal computers and laptops and into the world of portable computing. You see, up until 2007, the world of computing was divided into 2 main camps, computers and phones. And there was practically zero overlap between the two. A phone couldn't replace a computer, and a computer couldn't fulfill the need for a pocket-friendly phone. Then, in 2007, this happened.
An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. And we are calling it iPhone.
The world was greeted by the iPhone, a revolutionary device that shattered the status quo and proved the viability of touch controls for tasks like browsing the web, tasks that were the sole domain of computers until that point. It was a paradigm shift that left the tech world reeling in awe. And of course it didn't end there, because a year after the first iPhone, Android phones started taking market share away from computers as well. And then in 2010, the iPad created a whole new market of personal computing. Not only was this new market growing rapidly, but there was also speculation that the touchscreen tablet would soon replace most traditional keyboard and mouse computers. We now know that this did not happen, but back then it was a legit fear for companies based around computing. So it's no surprise Microsoft wanted a piece of the touchscreen market pie, or else risk sinking into obscurity. It's always the same. New thing comes out, big companies see it, their shareholders ask, why are you not doing that? Does this risk the company's future? And then they start doing it as well. A recent example would be the Metaverse. All the big tech companies wanted to be in the Metaverse. Not because they necessarily thought it's guaranteed to be the future, but because if it was and they were left behind, that could be the end of their company, no matter how successful they were before. So by the time these touch devices became popular, Windows 7 was already mostly complete. So Microsoft shifted their plans for touch compatibility to the next operating system, and that's where the downfall of Windows 8 truly began. Microsoft's chief executive at the time, Steve Ballmer, talked about the company's vision behind Windows 8 during their CES 2011 keynote.
Support for System on a Chip means that Windows will be everywhere on every kind of device without compromise. All the performance and flexibility of Windows on low-power, long-lasting devices. We're entering a new era of technology for consumers, where you'll be able to use Windows anywhere you go, from the small screen to the big screen.
Put simply, the folks at Microsoft wanted to bridge the gap between traditional desktop computing and low-powered touch-based devices. Their plan was simple: make Windows users stay on Windows no matter the type of device they used, whether it was a computer, a tablet, or even a phone. In fact, if you followed the console war in modern times, you would see that this mantra has remained the same. Because they decided one day, instead of competing with Sony over who has the best console, they'd instead make all of their games available on PC and Xbox at the same time, not enforcing console exclusivity and just trying to get as many people on a Windows device as possible, which is where the birth of Game Pass comes from. What Microsoft really cares about and what has made them this successful is that no matter what you're doing, it involves Microsoft. So keeping this in mind, in 2010 they were already experimenting with this idea when they released the Windows Phone 7, which ran Windows CE, a portable version of Windows that was extremely limited compared to the full operating system. So building upon this, the next plan was to create a Windows OS that worked the same on all devices. And I have to admit, the idea of it does sound extremely cool and futuristic, even today. To achieve this vision, Microsoft made some critical changes to its OS, the most notable of which was the brand new full-screen start menu that was much easier to use on a touchscreen. They also added a bunch of touch-friendly features such as the live tiles and charm bar, which did later become some of the most hated parts of the OS. Alongside these touchscreen-focused additions, Microsoft also overhauled the entire window look with a new theme called the Metro UI. This minimalist design, centered around the company's newly commissioned logo, was a departure from the traditional Windows aesthetic. So it's clear Microsoft was coming out all guns blazing. So much so, they hired Paula Scher, arguably one of the greatest graphic designers of our generation, to craft their new Metro UI. For context, Paula is the design mastermind behind the refined identity of Citibank, Shake Shack, and the Public Theater in New York City. So as the development of Windows 8 was coming to a close, the hype surrounding its launch was growing day by day. Not that there weren't skeptics, because there always are, But with the fantastic success of Windows 7, most people had forgotten about the disaster of Windows Vista. After all, they had the formula perfected, they knew exactly what people wanted, the slam dunk success of Windows 7 was so fresh in memory, how could anything go wrong? Of course, you know where this is going. In September of 2011, Microsoft released the first preview build of the upcoming OS. Opinions on this were mixed. While some liked the direction Windows was headed, others not so much. When asked about the preview build on Windows Forum, a user succinctly replied, "It sucks, let's hope it gets better, fast." But even with those mixed reviews, the preview build was downloaded over 535,000 times in less than 12 hours. The hype was real, and it continued right up until the release on October 26th, when the full version of Windows 8 came to the public.
The tech giant launched its newest operating system, Windows 8, in New York today. And Ballmer says it's the biggest change the system has seen in 17 years. Personal computers and tablets with the operating system built in will go on sale tomorrow, Friday.
What followed was one of the most brutal beatdowns by critics in tech history. I'm serious. I already knew that the reviews of Windows 8 were negative, but seriously, when you start looking into this, it was savage. For instance, everybody's favourite person from PC gaming, Mr. Gabe Newell himself, the founder of Valve and Steam, called Windows 8 a catastrophe for everyone in the PC space. When a sentence like that comes from Gabe Newell, you know things are bad. Some other publications didn't mince their words even though they had few. One such publication simply said, "fail." My favourite though is Beta News, who compared this OS to a bad blind date due to the amount of hype it had going into the launch contrasted with how badly it turned out to be. And it wasn't just smug critics either posting online their opinions like they always do. The general user base of Windows was also quite unhappy with the new version. If we were to try and sum up the overall sentiment the public had about Windows 8, we'd probably just use this clip.
And personally, I think it's bad enough that it warrants a product recall. I mean, it's that defective. How did this product get approved? How did it get released? Who signed off on this? Because honestly, they should be so horribly, horribly fired. Their employee ID card should be hung on pikes outside of Microsoft's Redmond HQ as a reminder to anyone else who perpetrates such stupidity.
But obviously it wasn't all bad, because if you know anything about the internet, somebody somewhere is going to like it. And we have to look no further than this guy on Reddit who drew the operating system as cute anime girls. So obviously he very much liked Windows 8, which means it was not a complete failure. That being said, this positive reception was the exception. Most hated it, and for good reasons. One such reason is, of course, as we discussed earlier, the UI issues. For example, a YouTuber took his laptop with Windows 8 to the public to see their reactions, and they all found navigating the new UI confusing and annoying.
That was your first time with Windows 8, what do you think?
That's the most confusing Windows I've ever been on so far.
I prefer 7.
I like the pretty icons that they have on here. That's about it.
This is really Windows 8.
This is really Windows 8.
To dive into it a little bit deeper, it was basically highlighting a major flaw in the redesigned UI. It aimed to be equally good for both tablets and desktop PCs, but ended up in the same way you'd expect when going in two opposite directions. They failed at both. Even if you used it enough to eventually understand how to use it, it still felt clunky, unrefined, and needlessly complicated in places. But funnily enough, when looking back, you can find gems like this user review who predicted the future. On July 25th, 2012, months before Windows 8's release, a user posted on the Windows subreddit asking, "Does anyone else hate Metro and everything Windows 8 is trying to do?" They further added, "Seriously, this will be a disaster for Microsoft. Windows 8 will fail harder than Vista. Nobody wants Metro. Nobody wants a fucking tablet OS on their goddamn desktop. What the fuck was Microsoft thinking?" Very eloquent, if I do say so. And of course, this turned out to be true. This was the exact problem with Windows 8. There was two horses pulling the product in two different directions, which wouldn't be so bad if you didn't need a whole product for both audiences. And of course, anyone who posts opinions online will discover, as this guy did, being early is the same as being wrong. This guy nailed it, but at the time he was heavily downvoted and mocked for posting what turned out to be completely true. One of the classics posted was, "Ever think of doing something productive instead of ranting about an OS that no one is forcing you to use?" Which is hilarious considering when Windows 8 released, most people decided, yeah, actually, we won't use it. But obviously this backlash, if that's what we're going to call it, does echo the hype and confidence in Microsoft that I was talking about earlier. Unfortunately, the reality of Windows 8 was not kind to these loyal fans. And to try and understand the questionable design choices behind this update, let's take a look at the power menu. It's a staple of Windows OS and one of the easiest ways to shut down or restart your PC. Since the introduction of the power menu feature in Windows 95, it was a part of the start menu. Now, take a guess at where the power menu was on Windows 8. Yes, I did foreshadow it, not in the start menu. So after 17 years of people using the Microsoft Windows OS, they decided to move one of the most used features that had no reason to be moved to a completely new location. And the new location is the thing nobody asked for, called the charm bar. And there wasn't a bouncer asking for your ID to get into the charm bar. Instead, you had to bring your cursor to the upper half of the left corner and then slide it down. Which would obviously raise the question, why would you force it into this weird location that people on PC wouldn't want to use? And the answer is pretty obvious, because this was designed, again, for tablet users. And to quote another website, ZDNet, Windows 8 was a design disaster. But it doesn't end there, because alongside the new UI, Windows also redid the Windows logo completely, and I do mean completely. This of course is a little bit of an aside because it's not that big of a deal, right? But people do care about logos for these companies and these products that they use in their day-to-day life. And unfortunately for Paula, the person who designed this, she came under fire for what people were calling wonky and too simple. Which was the light-hearted criticism, because Beta News stated the new logo is a mistake and one Microsoft could and should correct before Windows 8 ships in the autumn. When looking into why people cared so much about the logo, we just have to look at the general public's opinion. Every major release of Windows had kept the iconic four-coloured wave since 1992, and the departure from this very familiar symbol just didn't sit well with many people. After all, you can see this is what people have been using for most of their life. So Microsoft threw away 20 years of an iconic look and replaced it with something that's just boring. It's just not interesting at all. And while this might not seem like a big deal compared to the other changes to the OS, it was a massive deal for long-time Windows loyalists. To them, the logo change was a betrayal, signaling that Microsoft was going in a completely new direction, one that those loyal users didn't like. It sounds silly, but you only have to look at how people are with the products they consume. If this didn't exist, we wouldn't have a console war, we wouldn't have PC master race, we wouldn't have these people who were really diehard about their brands. So with all this outrage, it culminated in tons of negative press surrounding the new release, which in turn hit Microsoft where it hurt the most: sales. In the first week after its launch, only 4 million copies of Windows 8 were sold. I know I'm saying only, but for Microsoft standard, this was really bad. According to CNET, it was well below Microsoft's internal projections and was described inside the company as disappointing. Hearing that as a quote is kinda like your dad not being angry at you, just being disappointed instead. You can tell they really expected more from what they'd made. But obviously watching this video, hearing this information, you're gonna think, oh, it's all doom and gloom, right? But let me hit you with a crazy twist. The sales of Windows 8 licenses somehow surpassed Windows 7. Now don't get me wrong, Windows 8 sold terribly compared to its predecessor in the long run, but in the first month, Microsoft sold over 40 million copies of their shiny new OS, which puzzled just about everybody. But then when you get thinking about it, it makes sense, kinda. For one, most product launches, the earliest sales are from enthusiasts, and in Windows 8's case, most of these enthusiasts saw the early reviews and eagerly purchased the new version. Then came the general user base, which loved Windows 7 and was still on the hype train. They purchased a new Windows version to try out and ultimately were disappointed. It wasn't until reviews, word spreading around and people got it in their hands that the Windows 8 sales slowed down massively, with sales of new Windows devices dropping by 21% compared to the previous year, which is a massive number. This, ironically enough, was not just due to Windows 8, but also PC sales slowing down because people were buying more mobile phones than PCs, which was literally the exact opposite of Microsoft was hoping to achieve with Windows 8. But obviously as time goes on, people just rejected Windows 8, such as HP, who silently started promoting and selling Windows 7 computers again, basically rejecting Microsoft's new offering due to lagging sales and demand from customers. After all, anyone looking to buy a new PC didn't want Windows 8 on it, so these manufacturers started selling Windows 7 on them instead. But perhaps the biggest blow came from the enterprise sector, which includes massive customers of Microsoft products. If it's not being adopted by businesses, then obviously sales are going to tank real hard. To put it simply, companies didn't want to confuse their employees with the overhauled Windows layout or spend hundreds of man-hours training them on the new UI. That was going to cost them money for what, you may ask? Putting money in Microsoft's pockets and getting maybe the same performance as before? There was really nothing to be gained by companies adopting Windows 8. Especially considering Windows 8 was described as having, quote, disappointing usability for both novice and power users. But obviously as we wind down, it's normal, right, for new upgrades to have some drawbacks, because there's usually some stuff that makes up for it. What you miss in column A, maybe you make up for in column B. But unfortunately not for Windows 8. It seemed to just miss the mark completely, as obviously they didn't really know where the mark was. There was no meaningful benefits that would make these downsides worth the trouble, apart from touch-friendly screens, of course, which enterprise users didn't care about, and had no benefit for most PC users, which was most of the sales for Windows 8. I mean, if this update was released in 2024, people would be saying touch-friendly controls, more like Microsoft should touch some grass, so they could understand their users' real needs. I'm sorry, I don't know why I just said that. Because of this ongoing drama though, shitty reviews, terrible sales, Microsoft's reputation took a real nasty hit. After all, you're only as good as the latest thing you've done. It doesn't matter if people have been using your product for over 20 years, they just care about the thing that they're using now. Any trust you built up through Windows 7 being a great operating system was basically gone. I remember at the time the sentiment was real bad. Even now, if you speak to some old heads, they'll still not upgrade to the new version of Windows for years. I think for people who actually used Windows 8, they probably still don't trust what Microsoft's doing with Windows with any new version, even now. Doesn't matter if it's Windows 10, 11, 8.1, they're still going to think of Windows 8, they're still going to think of Windows Vista. And speaking of Windows 8.1, that was obviously Microsoft's attempt at damage control after the disastrous launch. It came 1 year after as a free upgrade with an aim to fix most issues that plagued its predecessor. For instance, they brought back the beloved start menu and made the desktop the main hub again. Which sounds so stupid. We took away this thing that's been a staple for like 2 decades, and then we've had to roll out a big update to give it you back 1 year later. But even still, with Windows 8.1 being an improvement, it just couldn't shake off the legacy of its predecessor. Critics acknowledged the effort, but they were never going to be fully convinced, highlighting that while it was better, it still wasn't great, it still wasn't Windows 7. And as CNET put it, improved Windows still torn between tablet future and PC past. Which brings us to when Windows 8.1 was sunset, with Windows 10 being their release 2 years later, and their second attempt at damage control. They made it so that anyone who had a valid copy of Windows 8 or 8.1 could upgrade to the brand new version for free. Can you imagine the amount of money Microsoft lost in giving the upgrade for free? All in an effort to win back its user base and prove to everybody, you know, we are still Microsoft. We are still committed to making the best operating system and having as many of you using it as possible. This would have cost them hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe more. And you can see the inspiration of Windows 7 that goes into Windows 10, which really puts focus into the age-old phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And in the years following Windows 10's release, it looked like Microsoft had learned from its mistakes. Rollout of new features was slow and methodical, and it also seemed like Microsoft was listening closely to the Windows community. After all, we've not had anything like Windows 8 since Windows 8. But that doesn't mean Microsoft aren't doing things that people are heavily criticizing. Just as I'm finishing writing this video, Microsoft announced new AI features for Windows 11 that nobody wanted or asked for. These features are essentially AI-powered spyware disguised as something useful.
I could be wrong on that, maybe it'll be useful eventually, but as of now, it's like a big dumb toddler. And Microsoft just recently announced a new feature for Copilot called Recall. And Recall is basically just spyware. It'll record everything you do on your PC at all times.
And given the backlash I'm seeing, it has the potential to cause another disaster, maybe with the shades of the Windows 8 launch. After all, nobody likes having things just shoehorned into their system, things that they don't want, things that they're not going to use, and it's just there. Which is why on days where these things are released, some of the most searched topics on the internet are just how to turn it off, because Microsoft makes it difficult to do, and people immediately will find a solution, post it, and then talk about it. With that being said, hopefully Microsoft continues to learn, and they listen to their community on this one, cancelling these plans, or maybe we'll be making another video about Microsoft in the near future. Either way, thanks for watching.